The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
Welcome, everybody, to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is a 21-minute or less weekly podcast to help you get your message out, grow your business, and build your bottom line. Let me help you bring your marketing and advertising into the 21st century. My name is David Garofalo. I've been doing podcasting since 2010, and by doing so, I've created myself a six-figure income from the podcast itself. It's a 21-minute podcast, so let's get the clock started. And here we go. Today's lesson, doing a podcast live. No editing. And that's what we're doing here today. And it's the way we do it on this podcast and every podcast that I've been doing since 2010. No editing. Did you know most podcasters spend more time editing their podcast than actually doing their podcast? It's true. Actually, they spend more time editing their podcast than anything else that has to do with their podcast. And that includes prepping for their podcast, doing research, and that's what we're going to talk about, and doing the show itself. Altogether, everything that they do to get ready to do their show, more time is spent on the editing process than anything else, than actually everything else altogether. More time spent on editing than everything else, and actually, I personally think there's no reason for it, and that's my opinion. It could lead to drop-offs of the show, actually burnout, and lack of success due to lack of motivation from doing the show, spending that amount of time re-listening to it and editing the show. They, the podcaster, wants the podcast to be perfect. It's a perfection thing. They want it to be perfect. Everybody wants their stuff to be perfect, but the fact of the matter is it never will be perfect. The definition of editing is the process of selecting and preparing audible media used to convey information. The editing process involves the correction, condensing, organizing, and many other modifications performed with the intent of producing a correct, consistent, accurate, complete work. So that is the idea of what they're trying to accomplish, but it will never get to that perfect place. Therefore, I think no editing is better than lots of editing, in my opinion. Editing requires listening to the same thing over and over to try to find the mistake. Try to find it. Might not even be there, but keep looking and keep looking till you end up finding something that you can correct. Have you ever heard the expression, "It's the last place I looked"? Well, who's looking after they actually found it, right? The fact of the matter is, it is the last place you look because after you find it, you stop looking for it. But not if you're editing for podcasting. You never stop looking. It's a never-ending battle to end up finding the mistakes. And that's if it's even there. It takes a skillful eye and ear to actually find it, and may require more work and time to do it properly, to correct it properly. Most likely, the skillful ear is not the ear of the person listening to your show. So they would never hear it in the first place. So why go through all that time and effort to correct something that most likely nobody would ever have picked up on? In my opinion, it's the number one reason it's held back on lots of great people. The desire for perfection. That's the reason why they don't go forward, they don't get great. It's the desire for perfection. And it can kill you. It can put you out of business and ruin your podcast. We all want to do the best we can. That's why you're listening to this show right now. You either want to learn or you want to get better. Thriving for perfection is, on a podcast, is next to impossible. Perfection. It's impossible. Perfection may be what you want, but it may be also what is holding you back. You need to get your content out. I'll even go as far as to say those doing editing on their podcasts are improving less than those who live with what they have recorded and uploaded while they're listening to the errors, with the errors in it. That's how they'll improve it, by hearing it themselves with the errors in it, and next time correct it without those errors. This podcast, for instance, the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, is not only recorded live and not edited. It's done in front of a live audience in a cafe. There's people here looking at me as I'm doing this. The Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is in Salem, New Hampshire. I've spent a lot of time on my research than anything else doing this podcast. And that is where I spend most of the time doing for a podcast, is the prep. That's where I think the most value is. This show, the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, is 21 minutes or less, and there's zero editing. So besides getting the prep work for the show, there's no other time needed than 21 minutes or less. I need all the extra time I can possibly have is to create more content, because the more content I have out there, the more my message gets out there. It is content that drives listeners. The more listeners, the more attractive it will be to the advertiser. The more advertising, the more money comes in. On this show, the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, as I look through my stats, it's pretty clear. The more content that I put out, the more listeners I get. The more listeners I get, the more appointments I get to show them the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe here in Salem, New Hampshire. And the better chance of a customer becoming a customer at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. So that's what it comes down to. It's that simple. Do you know about the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe? Not the podcast, but the place? Well, if you don't, here it is.
If you're in the area of Boston North into southern New Hampshire and you're thinking about doing a podcast, there is a place you have to see. It's called Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Located right over the border into Salem, New Hampshire, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is a live, working, full-service podcast and vodcast, that's video on demand, studio. All professional equipment, professional producer, and total distribution of your podcast is done for you. Would you like search engine optimization for more people to find your business, or better ranking on Google? Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe can do it all for you for far less than you think. Schedule a free 21-minute, no-obligation consultation by going to www.studio21podcast.cafe. That's studio21podcast.cafe. Now, back to the program.
And we are back. Today, talking about doing a podcast live, and that's what we're doing, a live podcast at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. No editing, just like I'm doing here in front of a live audience. We're talking about all the time it takes to spend on perfection, and that maybe it just might be hurting your show. Even when you get good at editing, it takes 4 times longer to edit than it actually does to record the program. So a 1-hour show will take you, obviously, 1 hour to record, but will take you over 4 hours to actually edit the program. And it's still not going to be perfect. For video editing, if you do vodcasting, that's video on demand on your podcast, and maybe you don't because of the editing, it takes over an hour for each minute of the editing process. An hour for every minute. So if you're doing a 60-minute vodcast, video on demand, audio and video, it's going to take you 60 hours to edit that show. I can't imagine you're going to be putting a lot of content out. You're going to actually shorten the show. You're actually going to skip over weeks, and then you're going to actually quit. That's how it's going to go. There's companies that do it for you. They'll do all this for you, all the editing, the podcast editing services. It will cost you between $500 and $1,000 per month for that editing service, if that's what you end up using there. How about being exactly who you are? Not perfect. When you flubber, like I do all the time, you verbally correct it, if you catch it. Or you just keep going. If it's time to clear my throat, I just clear my throat because people do that. Most likely you're not the only one that notices because you're your biggest critic. They're going to hear you out there. Maybe they're going to hear you, but you're going to hear it more than they are. You are your biggest critic, or you should be. But be genuine. Show them your warts. Meaning, if you got them and everybody can see them, don't hide them. For instance, I don't know if you noticed, but I have a terrible New England accent.
No.
Oh, you did notice?
I noticed.
Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is in New England, just 30 miles north of Boston, and that's where I come from. No surprise there, right? You heard it. Why hide it? Turns out some people actually like listening to the accent. But either way, this is what I sound like, and I can't help it, and I'm not going to edit it out, and I'm not going to spend that kind of time. I'll actually create a different show. Or maybe I'll create a show around the accent. Who knows, but this is the way it is. This is what I sound like, and I'm going to live with it. Listen, if you make a terrible mistake or something that you would never want to be said, or some terrible feedback or something that really went wrong in the show, edit it out. That's the beautiful bonus about a podcast. But treat it like the safety net that it is, and don't rely on it. It's only going to slow you down and hurt you big time. So to wrap it up, doing a podcast live, I'm a big believer that being myself, playing myself and recording myself as is. This is me, and that's what you get. I've done over 1,000 hours of podcasting and haven't edited one yet. And I'm only going to edit, and I'm actually not going to edit this one either. You hear the flubs, you hear the bumps, the things that are there. They're there, they're going to stay there, and that's the way it is. Did you hear something wrong? If you listened in, listening to the show, listen to it again. See if you hear it. See if you hear the mistakes that I made. All I know is you listened all the way through, and I got the message out, and that's what matters. That's my 21 minutes or less, and it was less. If you want to talk to me, get your message out, message me at the Contact Us button on the Studio 21 Podcast.cafe. Set up a meeting with me. Let me show you Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, and I'll even buy you the coffee. Next week, the show introduction, also known as the show intro. But this is the show outro. Next week, we'll talk about the intro. That's my 21 minutes or less, and we're out of here. You've been listening to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, live from the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe on the United Podcast Network.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.